This is the Forbes Books Podcast, conversations with remarkable folks who are impacting the world of business and beyond. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and as you know, I like to share some of my favorite books on the pod and talk to authors about them. But today, we're not talking about business books, we're talking about a show business book. We all know Marvel Studios, the folks who turned comic book characters into cinematic icons, who made billions of dollars at the box office, and who created the most epic crossover event in movie history. But how did they do it? How did they go from being a struggling studio on the verge of bankruptcy to being the undisputed kings of Hollywood? And what does it take to bring their amazing stories to life on the big screen? That's what you'll find out in MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios, a fascinating new book by Joanna Robinson, Dave Gonzales, and Gavin Edwards. They interviewed more than 100 Marvel insiders, from studio boss Kevin Feige to star Chris Hemsworth to hairstylists, to give us the inside scoop on the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And today I'm lucky enough to have the aforementioned Joanna Robinson and Dave Gonzales, who are amazing writers and podcasters, to talk about their new book, their love for Marvel, and what's next for our favorite superheroes. Joanna, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
You're very welcome. And Dave, welcome as well.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. Excited to talk about the MCU.
Yeah, me too. I'm a nerd just like many millions of people out there. So let's start by going in reverse. Start with 2023, because 2023 was a really wild year for the MCU. You had the Victoria Alonso firing, the backlash of Ant-Man and Thor, but then a little rebound with Guardians. So Joe, talk to me about how this book sort of ends but continues, because I'm sure as you guys were writing this book, everything was going so great with the MCU. Then all of a sudden you start to see this steady decline. I don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but how do you end the book in terms of the timeline of the MCU?
Yeah, that's a really good question that we asked ourselves over the years of writing the book. What's the finish date? At one point, Dave suggested we do it blade to blade, starting with like Wesley Snipes' blade and then ending with Mahershala Ali's blade, but that kept getting pushed back. So we had to find another natural ending. And we had kind of tied everything up at January, at the beginning of this year, 2023, in January. And then, things started to move and shake and happen. And so we wound up having to, add and expand. And actually, it made the ending feel a lot more dynamic. It wasn't like, and everything's great, and Marvel's on top, and what could stop them? And what we found in the end is that you then get this really interesting arc of an unlikely beginning, a meteoric rise, an incredible dominant reign, hence the title of the book. And then, oh no, what do we do now? What happens now? And a lot of the pieces that we found throughout the book that were already there really helped set the path for where we've landed now. So we didn't have to change a lot. We just had to sort of connect some dots, because some of the stuff like Victoria Alonso or the VFX situation or a number of different things were already bubbling under the surface, and then it just there was an eruption this year. But we both agree, Dave and I both agree, that it's too soon to report Marvel dead on arrival. We don't think that is the case of what has happened in 2023. I like to call it the wobble. Dave, I don't know if you have developed a cute nickname for it yet.
No, I like the wobble. I just think that even though maybe we have seen a reduction in box office, there's a bunch of different factors to that. And the reduction in enthusiasm, I think, doesn't read as weird to me as someone who's followed the Marvel Cinematic Universe for a long time. I feel like we're really in the after Age of Ultron phase, where it's like, oh, that Avengers movie wasn't as good as we thought. And so I'm waiting really until a future Avengers movie comes out to sort of judge, does the sauce still exist? Because between the various strikes and the COVID pandemic, a lot of Phase 4 and early Phase 5 got disrupted by things that disrupted all of the studios, and nothing's been performing like Endgame and Infinity War and Captain Marvel and Black Panther. So it was a key point in history, but I don't think the Marvel Cinematic Universe can be counted out yet, especially since there isn't really a competitor. Just everything film-wise sort of became lesser in terms of reaction, unless you're Barbie and Oppenheimer, but that's an unpredictable phenomena, I think.
And I want to get into the pandemic and strike and all that stuff, but one thing I want to jump on that Joanna mentioned was that you guys had completed this book in January. And as authors, writers, creators, you always want to create something for the masses. You want as many people to read as possible. But then all of a sudden, when you see this little wobble, as Joanna mentioned in 23, Dave, were you like, oh my God, is anyone going to care about an MCU book? Were you having sort of like this imposter syndrome type effect? Like, is anyone going to care when this book comes out?
There was a little bit of that, but I think we refocused around the fact that we're doing a history of a very specific point in time, and that point in time has a natural end that we found. We thought it was going to be like at the end of Phase 4, as it was like, well, Marvel's doing a little bit too much on Disney Plus, and the Phase 4 movies maybe weren't as successful. But then extending it out into Phase 5, we were able to find like different endpoints that actually, as we were rewriting it. So we finished it in like January, news started happening. And that was at the period of time where we couldn't really alter the page count by that much. So it was a lot of like, what can we include and what can we include without making it feel like we shunted it in at the very end. And we were really surprised to find with stuff like Victoria Alonso and Ike Perlmutter, that had been going through our book anyway, sort of like the conflicts between them and the Marvel leadership and Disney especially. So those didn't feel like unnatural endings, even though we were really doing a whole bunch of fixes with like, okay, we have, 6 lines that we can expand this story with. What are the most effective 6 lines? So there was a period of time with this book where it was kind of getting it all into shape, and then some really hardcore journalism for the last couple of months. But I think we managed to shake it all out, where really it's talking about Marvel from the 90s through 2023. Anything that happens beyond that, I feel will also be a story separate from the one we're telling. I think like we really captured what we set out to write about.
That's awesome. And Joanna, Dave mentioned the pandemic, and I believe the pandemic effect on the MCU, I think we're still feeling it. There have been accounts of them having to juggle release dates with the Doctor Strange 2 and then Spider-Man movie with Sony. How badly, in your investigation and your hundreds of interviews, did the pandemic affect MCU's quote-unquote master plan?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because what has made the MCU such a phenomenon in the first place is that carefully woven tapestry that they have, where stories feed into another. There's just like a really fine balance. I always like to think of it as like keeping all these plates spinning, right? And then if you have to, the plates are spinning on sticks, let's say, and you have to move the sticks from hand to hand, like you're going to drop some plates. That's going to happen. And so I think that when we look at this later Marvel era with the influx of content from Disney Plus, where we're not just making a couple movies a year, that if maybe we move them around, we can figure it out, but we've got all these shows that we're trying to keep spinning as well. I think when you look at something like Doctor Strange and the Spider-Man movie that switched release dates, and you look at whole plot lines that were cut and things that got patched over and reshoots that mostly make sense, but maybe if you poke at them a little bit, don't. I think it starts to mess with Marvel's whole process, where they love to sort of create the movie fully in reshoots. But it's hard to do that when you're trying to carry so much continuity, especially to your point about Spider-Man, when you're trying to do that in conjunction with another studio that may not always be entirely friendly with Sony. So Sony's not going to play ball and move their Spider-Man movie to accommodate your Doctor Strange movie. So it's been a really tricky thing. And something that I've been thinking about a lot is, does Marvel need to use an old school Gwyneth Paltrow term, like consciously uncouple some of its storylines so that they can have sort of isolated little stories that people can check in on and not feel like they have to do all this homework in order to understand, and not feel like if they move one around to another time, things will get hopelessly tangled.
And Dave, you mentioned the strike there. Now, how do you see the strike affecting everything going forward? Is it, I don't think we'll see a pandemic effect, but how is that going to screw up? Because I know there was already, like, they were moving up Deadpool 3. They were doing all this juggling before the strike. Now we're recording this after the writer strike's over, but not the SAG-AFTRA one. So hopefully by the time this drops, it does. But what kind of residual effects have the last 5 or 6 months had on Hollywood in terms of how MCU is going forward with their plan?
Yeah, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, starting with like Iron Man in 2008, developed this sort of like best idea wins up until the final edit. So if they found a way they could plus the movie or plus the story, they would try to make that happen. So in the first Iron Man, that was also up against the 2008 strike, and they happened to get some writers to write an entirely new ending for that movie right before the strike was called. And because of that, they sort of went to ILM and had them create what's now the icing finale of the original Iron Man entirely out of plates and visual effect shots they had already collected. And so something like that was still open. Marvel still operates in that way, even though they're operating across multiple TV shows and movies in that way right now, which sort of makes it all kind of feel hangdog. But they want the original movie to end the best way possible and then also feed into the larger story. So I think the interesting thing about the strike was since it took a couple of months for the SAG-AFTRA to join the WGA, they kept filming unless they were shut down by picket lines, because really anything that they were capturing was going to be altered after the strike was finished. That's part of, they build a reshoot schedule into their budgeting for every movie. So when it started and Deadpool 3 was still going and Captain America, Brave New World were still going, I was very curious as to, especially with something like Deadpool, where the main character, like, you never see his mouth. I'm sure it was easy to film some stunt scenes to work off sets you had already built. And I don't think we're going to see a lot of hiccup in that, because that's just so easy to fix and post. And with people like Hugh Jackman returning, they're going to be willing to contribute the budget for that. Things like Captain America, things like Wonder Man, things like Agatha Coven of Chaos, which was largely finished and would have been in that plussing stage when the writer's strike hit. Those are going to be the projects that I have an eye on as to, can you tell that it was massively rewritten? Something like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which got triggered a rewrite during the pandemic because they had some extra time. So they're like, let's see if we can make this better. And they largely ended up rewriting it. And then something even as recently as Secret Invasion, where there's very good evidence that at least half of it was sort of restructured before the big batch of reshoots did. So because Marvel's always in this churn, it's going to make it possibly evident, but definitely a gigantic headache for production when suddenly you don't have access to your writers or your actors. And it's going to be interesting to see how they patchwork that together. I don't know, considering something like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania looks like it was majority performed on a blue screen stage, if we're going to be able to tell, but at least those are the projects that I have my eyes on.
I also have to wonder, to your point about the churn, Dave, is if obviously we are pro-union, we are pro-strike, we are really glad that the writers and hopefully the actors will get what they're asking for. But if there is some sort of silver lighting for the work stoppage, at least for Marvel, it is perhaps a pause to get some ducks in a row, try to plan a little further in the future, not, crossing the picket lines by doing writing, but doing sort of planning and premising and positioning and prioritizing and really figuring out where they want to hit these things, because that has been a problem for them for the last couple of years, is that rapid increase in churn because of the Disney Plus content. Bob Iger wound up being something of a villain of the writer's strike, but before that happened, came out and said, we kind of want to do less. We want to do less. And so I'm hoping with something like the Marvels that was shot, that was done, maybe in that time, in that work stoppage for writers and actors, in the edit, they were able to sort of refine and refine and refine. And I am very hopeful for that movie. And Marvel certainly needs to end the year, between Loki and the Marvels, needs to end the year on an upswing to restore people's faith in what's going on over there.
That's awesome. And Joanna, in terms of the interviews you did, the hundreds of interviews you did, one thing that I know that the MCU has pulled off, just a level of greatness that we'll probably never see again. But do the insiders, realize how lucky they were? And what I mean by lucky is in terms of like having a full cast of people under contract for over a decade without any hiccups in the social media world where anything get blown up, people get fired, people get canceled, people do bad things. Over the course of the MCU, that never happened. And ironically, they started with the most controversial actor of its time in Robert Downey Jr. taking a risk there, but went through decades without having any issues. Then all of a sudden, 23 happens, and again, now you have the Jonathan Majors of it all in terms of what they're going to do with him. So without getting too deep into that rabbit hole, Joanna, did the folks at the MCU just know how lucky they were able to pull off this feat?
I think one of our favorite people that we talked to is Sarah Halifin, who casts all of the Marvel projects. And listening to her process in casting, it is in addition to the best actor or someone who seems to be committed enough to do the extreme workouts that they need to do in order to get into superheroic shape, there is a sort of demeanor that they were looking for. We talked to some people who maybe it didn't leach all the way into social media, but there was some behind the scenes conflict that we get into in the book. There was the public exit of Edgar Wright that was pretty controversial at the time. And eventually down the road, you get what we have heard was called the no assholes policy on set. So that is something that was sort of hard won. They were lucky that some of those bigger eruptions happened at the beginning of the MCU before there was as much scrutiny on what was going on, before social media was as vigilant, before the MCU was so big. I think some of those early blowups would have marked them were it not for the time that they came out in. But I think also it was the shows and the films were cast very intentionally with the right people. And to your point about Downey, that is one of my favorite stories that like kicks off the book, is how they got Downey, how much Downey wanted it, you know, and how much Downey saw it as sort of a fresh start, next step for him. And so he wasn't going to mess that up. Right. And so I think it's really fascinating to think about what some of those early conflicts, again, that we captured in the book would have felt like to the larger audience if they had happened now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously with Iron Man to Iron Man 2, you had the recasting of Terrence Howard. And is it true, Dave, that Terrence Howard was the highest paid actor on Iron Man 1? Or is that like an old wives' tale that spread on the internet?
No, that's absolutely true. He was coming off, Hustle and Flow, and people were thinking that he was going to become no, I don't want to be thinking. He did become ascendant at that point. He was a big star. And it got to the point where he was the first one attached. He was the first one attached for the salary that he got. And there was a lot of confusion even initially, where it's like, did they just cast Terrence Howard as Tony Stark? And people were like, no, he's going to be Rhodey. We're going to find somebody else for Tony Stark. But yeah, he definitely was the highest paid. That probably had something to do once they had to get down to budget negotiations with him being replaced, because who wants to take a cut for a part 2 that was wildly successful? I understand his frustration that they had to make some budget room for Robert Downey Jr., who they absolutely couldn't have done it without.
No doubt. And jumping from the birth of the MCU in 2008 to the peak of the MCU in 2019, when they put out a couple of multi-billion-dollar movies in Avengers Endgame and Captain Marvel. And now, strangely, if a movie of theirs doesn't make $1 billion, it's considered a bomb in some circles. For example, Thor: Love and Thunder only made $700 million worldwide, and people called it a flop. So, Joanna, are Feige and company victims of their own successes?
Yeah, I mean, that was the question for all of us immediately post-Endgame. Is sort of like, how do we keep them down on the farm after they've seen Endgame, after you've accomplished something that massive? And in doing so, a lot of what I like to call like the varsity team decides to leave for a number of different reasons. And so all of a sudden, you're in this new position. You've seeded your team with a bunch of new players like Brie Larson, but also like Chadwick Boseman, who like unfortunately was meant to be a linchpin for them going forward. And that is, of course, no longer the case. Or Chris Hemsworth, who has decided he wants to step back for various reasons. So they had made these plans to sort of replace or promote some people on the team in order to make it all feel as big as it did when that original core cast was there. But again, COVID, just a number of elements happened. The Sony deal sort of feeling shakier than it did, back when Endgame came out. All of those factors, I think, make the movies feel like they're struggling to catch up to that early glory. And I think failure is such an interesting word to use when it comes to Marvel, because it continuously outperforms all these other movies. And you make a fine point. You're like, they made a ton of movies, ton of money, but it's not as much as they used to make. So does it feel like a failure if you're not growing and growing and growing and growing? But I think to Dave's earlier point, you need to look at the larger film landscape and how all movies are making less money and all movies are having a harder time getting to $1 billion. And especially one of my favorite chapters that we have in the book is the China chapter. And that's a really interesting financial geopolitical element of when China decided to wrap its arms around Marvel, and then when in the post-game Endgame era it decides to not, and movies don't open in China for several iterations at Marvel, and they're starting to get back in there. But that's, of course, it's a huge blow in terms of the worldwide box office accumulation. So I think, again, that's one of those factors, along with COVID and this, that, and that, and the other thing, that adds up to a cinematic empire that doesn't seem as bulletproof as it once did.
And Dave, the one constant of the MCU, Joanna's breaking down all the casting and the changes, and you guys talk about plot points got swapped out in post-production. The one constant is Feige. So talking about your access to Feige, how much you were able to get out of him. Talk to me about how involved he was in this book, Dave.
Joanna spent several hours in his office in, I think, late 2018 to sort of get the Endgame story, get a feel for him, get his personal biography. And then as things progressed, pandemic-wise, and then eventually in 2021 when Marvel started releasing things again, we were also able to have access to him doing promotion for things like WandaVision and Loki, and moving forward and being able to check in with the general press. So Feige's all the way through this. Initially, our editor wanted us to focus almost exclusively on Feige, and we're like, don't worry, he's going to be there in every story, because that's the secret sauce of Marvel, and part of the reason why once you start making 3 to 4 television series a year on top of your 3 movies a year, and then a Sony co-production, why Kevin Feige gets spread a little bit thin, and they have tried to establish a Marvel Parliament, which are a bunch of very talented creative producers, some of which have been with Marvel since like early Phase 2, and they were trying to be substitute Feige's, and sometimes that works. The majority of the time it doesn't. There's just some weird secret sauce. I'm kind of worried for the man. Like, he's never going to be able to retire. I don't want him to become a Bob Iger, like, hey, I'm back to fix your stuff. But, like, honestly, that's a possibility at this point if he decides he's ever going to leave and do something else. For a while, it looked like he was going to do a Star Wars, but they're not going to let him go to do a Star Wars. So Kevin Feige is the linchpin. Although he always was a very strong creative force, but it really wasn't until he was able to wrangle complete control towards the beginning of Phase 3 that you really see the peak Marvel. And I think that sort of proves the thesis that we had all along, that it is Kevin Feige magic, a sort of indescribable pixie dust that connects the audiences to the Marvel movies. And I think it's ultimately because Kevin Feige loves movies, loves blockbuster movies first, and realized he needed to make himself an expert in the Marvel IP in order to execute it correctly. And he just does the work. He answers the emails. He maybe doesn't sleep, but that's Kevin Feige.
Joanna, you spent so much time with Feige. Have you been able to figure out how he's pulled this whole thing off with all these interconnected movies and TV shows? Forever, Hollywood chased franchises, but now it's all about creating a shared universe. Outside of Marvel, I think the only ones who have succeeded are the Conjuring folks. Why was he able to accomplish something that so many have tried and failed?
I think if you asked him, I mean, first of all, he would never say that anyone else failed, because he's one of the most diplomatic people you'll ever meet. And that's a big part of it, because he is, I think, one of the most brilliant creative producers Hollywood has ever seen. I think that's undeniable. But there's also, he's so kind. He does not make enemies, but you cannot get as high as he got in Hollywood without being something of a political animal. So he is diplomatic. He keeps all those relationships as healthy, as vibrant as he can. That is a key part to his success, I think, because you just keep everyone happy and enthusiastic to be working at Marvel. That is a key part of everything that's going on here. And I think, as opposed to sort of the shifting powers that be at the DC EU attempts, let's say, to have this core studio, these core creative producers, to have Feige at the top and then one creative producer assigned to each movie to report back to Feige, to have Feige act as an almost director producer on these projects, where in addition to talking to Kevin, which we were lucky enough to do, we talked to so many people who worked with him for so long-term producers at Marvel Studios. And they talked about how he has this process of go out, shoot your movie, bring me the pieces back to Marvel, and then I'll help us make the movie, and then we'll reshoot it to fill in the gaps, And so that's not something the head of any other studio, let alone the head of, DC is doing over Warner Brothers. So, a wholly distinctive approach.
Let's talk about something I really don't like talking about, but it's important. I want to see how it connects to the MCU, but toxicity in fandom. Joanna, you're obviously, covering this on a daily basis on your podcast, writings and everything like that. So I'm wondering if this came up in conversation with MCU, but how did they deal with that? Because obviously being this behemoth of a studio, you're going to be more mass appeal, but then you also have these pockets of toxicity, and they live mostly on Reddit and Twitter and such. How does MCU resolve their relationship with them? Do they let it affect them in any way? Do they block it out? Do they ignore it? Do they listen a little bit? What's their relationship to that world?
I actually think Marvel is one of the better fandom properties that doesn't let the sort of loud minority buffet them in one direction or another, as opposed to, I would say, sorry to throw them under the bus on an early Monday morning, but like Lucasfilm has been very reactive in a way that I don't think Marvel has been necessarily. And I think something that Disney as a whole, in terms of PR, sort of their approach is don't comment on it, don't engage with it, don't amplify it. It's a tiny minority that is very vocal. Doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact necessarily here, there, elsewhere. Like I would think the Captain Marvel test case, to your point earlier, Captain Marvel made over $1 billion, right? This is a massive success. People don't remember it that way for some reason. People think Captain Marvel wasn't a successful Marvel movie. And I was like, actually, it got good reviews, made a hideous amount of money. But I think what people remember are the review bombings that happened from people who weren't delighted that there was necessarily a woman at the center of a Marvel movie. And then when you interview Brie Larson herself, I think she's been tremendously impacted by the way that vitriolic response hit her. She gave this sort of, and I don't blame her, slightly embittered response. I believe it was at a D23 interview where she's like, where they were asking, are we going to see more Carol Danvers? And she was like, well, does anyone want to see more Carol Danvers? And so I kind of think that if there isn't more Carol Danvers in the future, it might be because Brie Larson doesn't want to put up with all of that. And who could possibly blame her? So I think there is an impact. As with any sort of loud minority, it can wear on you. But I think Marvel has been very good at not letting it sink into their plans.
All right, so Dave, this pod's going to drop between the Loki season premiere and the Marvels movie we've been talking about. I don't want to get all crystal ball-y here, but what do you guys see as the next couple of years for Marvel? Joanna kind of hinted that maybe the SAG-AFTRA strike maybe helped hit the reset button, but do you see that they've got a little more of a focused attention going forward in the next couple of years?
I think so. This is what Joanna has dubbed, and I've learned to now agree with it, like the Feige fix-it period. Like looking forward into Phase 5, like he's bringing back the old X-Men. He's not like, we're going to replace X-Men. We're going to wait for that. That's going to happen eventually. They're starting to have very early meetings about it. But he's like, we're going to make all the pre-Iron Man movies like side canon. It turns out the multiverse was just a way to make sure people engaged with the IP that they enjoyed, and also being told that it mattered. So we saw that in like Spider-Man No Way Home. It's like, you didn't watch these other Spider-Man series only to have us trash it and be like, Tom Holland's been the only one. It's like, no, it's the continuum. And so we're going to see that with, I think, a bunch of Marvel characters, which I anticipate is going to be slightly better received than Phase 4, which was like, here's our new Marvel adaptation characters. Here's the Eternals, here's Miss Marvel, here's a bunch of new stuff you haven't seen before. This is going to be a lot more like the Illuminati in Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, which again was very profitable for them, where it's like Kevin Feige is like, oh, hey, you think Liv Tyler's out of this series? She's not. You think William Hurt's going to get out just by, leaving this mortal coil? Boom, Harrison Ford. So I think we're going to reclaim everything in a way that leads to a gigantic climactic event, which I'm assuming is going to be Secret Wars, if you've read any of the comics it's based on, where it's like, you thought these individual things were Marvel, but everything that's ever said Marvel is part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse. And so hopefully they're going to be able to recapture enthusiasm doing that and then push on into something else, a soft reboot that I'm at least expecting right now to be Fantastic Four and X-Men focused, since those are two gigantic properties that could be very profitable, but also need a little bit more runway before I think they become Avengers level properties. But an X-Men team movie can perform at an Avengers level if they put enough thought into how we get there.
And to Feige's credit and everyone at Marvel and everyone at Disney for you know, quote unquote allowing this, though we talked about how hard won his control over Marvel was for Kevin. They acquired Fox years ago at this point. And every year in Hall H at Comic-Con or wherever it is, we're like, where are the X-Men? Where's Fantastic Four? Where are the X-Men? That's why we're here, right? You know, and he's like, we're not ready. We're going to take our time. We're going to do it right. We're not going to rush to give you an all new X-Men lineup when your head is still spinning from the Apocalypse era, you know, a younger mutant cast that we just got through over at Fox. And so I think that patience hopefully will pay off. And to Dave's point, in the meantime, they're having a lot of saucy fun by giving us Sir Patrick Stewart is here. Hugh Jackman's coming back. You like Deadpool? We still have Deadpool. You think we're squeaky clean Disney? No, we're going to do a Deadpool movie. So I think that's an interesting way in which they're engaging with that expanded empire without rushing it and fumbling this potentially massively lucrative property that they've acquired.
All right. I want to get a little nerdy with you, Joanna, because as a Gen Xer, my introduction to superhero comics and the superhero lore of Marvel was Secret Wars. That was like my first main comic. It got me attached to all the other ones. I had all the Secret War toys with the stupid shield out of hologram. I still don't know what that was all about.
Yeah.
But the rumor has it that the Secret Wars movie that Dave alluded to is going to serve as that soft reboot where essentially it's going to end and then basically it'll be MCU 2.0. Is that how you're feeling it going to come down the pike? I mean, I'm still years away from it. God knows now how long it's delayed. But do you think that's what Secret Wars will do? Will introduce sort of like a Marvel 2.0?
I think if they were smart, that's what they would do. Because I'm just hearing more and more, especially like as we go on the road to promote this book. And when I talk to Marvel skeptics, they will say, you know, people who want to talk to us about the book but are not wholly invested, as nerdily invested as you are, having, you know, engaged with Secret Wars back in the day, that Marvel starts to feel like homework for them. That you have to go all the way back to the first Iron Man movie and watch all those movies. If you're introducing it to, like, say, your kids, you love Marvel, you want your kids to be into Marvel, and you're like, all right, sit down. We've got all these movies and shows to get through for you to understand what's going on in the next thing. So that homework starts to feel like a barrier of entry for people, when that's exactly what Marvel crushed at the beginning of their franchise, is making their franchise friendly for people who had never picked up a comic in their life and knew nothing about the backstory of these characters. And so I think that idea of a soft reboot via Secret Wars, of you don't have to have spent the last decade and a half with us. You can come in fresh and know what's going on. I think it almost behooves them to do that. What do you think? What do you think, Dave, on the Secret Wars front?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, just as a way of a multiverse strategy, when I heard that the next 3 phases were going to be the multiverse saga, is incredibly smart for a lot of different reasons, but mostly it allows them to be very, very flexible. Like, Secret Wars happens, we come out with just the good parts, just the actors who want to keep doing it, and then sort of get to say goodbye to the people that are probably, you know, Hugh Jackman does not want to get in that shape every 3 years for the rest of his life. And it's probably not healthy to do so.
But on that subject, Dave, though, rumors were all hearing on Secret Wars. Like, what kind of budget is that going to have? Is that movie going to cost like $500 million if the rumors are true that they're bringing Tobey Maguire back and they're going to do Hugh, they're going to do old X-Men? I mean, can they even pull that off?
I mean, they're going to have to, and that's the sort of, I think, the solid goal that the Avengers franchise still is, by having the title Avengers before it, and that monetarily you can't tell them they need less money for an Avengers movie to a certain point, because they did it with Infinity War and Endgame. That was a huge spend. If one of those didn't perform the exact way they did, we'd be in real trouble. But I think that like you bet it all on that, and they're building towards it now so that will be an event that will be 4-quadrant, because if you like Miss Marvel because you're maybe on the younger end, or if you like She-Hulk because you're on the less serious end, all the way back to like you were around since 2000's X-Men, you're going to have all of these pieces that are drawing you into the movie. And I'm not even talking about what the movie's actually about at this point, which means it's going to be a whole other thing that they're able to build on. But just the smart way of doing the multiverse means you could have Tobey Maguire, but also if you don't want to be involved with Jonathan Majors, you just have some guy kick Jonathan Majors off a cliff and be like, I'm Kang from this Earth. And you're like, oh yeah, cool. I know I've done that. I've done that in like 3 movies already. So it's a sort of narrative elasticity that the first 3 phases were missing, because the first 3 phases were like, here's Captain America, here's Thor, here are our Avengers line up with Iron Man. They're each going to get trilogies. Each, phase is going to culminate in an Avengers movie. And then that Avengers movie is going to change the status quo for our hero Avengers characters. We're not in that format anymore. And because of that, I think there's so much more you could build upon to have this gigantic climactic event where you put everything in the kitchen sink. And by that point, you have a sort of reading as to what your next generation of heroes is going to be. And you allow them to successfully transfer out of, yes, to your point, what I think is going to be one of the most expensive movies to make ever. Because I think they're still probably developing technology that they're going to use for that. This is, the same company that owns Lucasfilm that's doing incredible work with like digital doubles and deepfakes. Can we get, Hugh Jackman fighting Hugh Jackman again? Probably. Like, I think all these things are possible if they build to it, which now it seems like they have the time to do.
And Joanna, one more nerdy point for me is I feel like the MCU sort of lost their way in 3, 4, 5 because of the fact that it was all over the place. So you have a multiverse with Doctor Strange, you have dimensions with Miss Marvel, you have timelines with Loki, and I think the average person was like, wait, what is this? I thought it was just good guys and bad guys. Like, did they do? That's more of an opinion thing. Do you think they lost their way by introducing so many different cosmic concepts as opposed to just like everything's a multiverse? Nope, we got multiverse over here, we got multi-dimension here, we got timelines here. To me, as a consumer and someone who's read these comics for decades, I can kind of get it, but I'm still kind of annoyed that they went there. So, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think even the high-level nerds that I get to work with and talk to on a daily basis and debate things with, they have differing opinions about what cracked the multiverse open. Was it the finale of Loki? Was it what happened, in Spider-Man? Was it what happened in Doctor Strange? To your earlier point about juggling the release dates of Doctor Strange and Spider-Man, I think that muddied things. I think they have a lot of ambitious. When we spoke to Kevin Feige sort of on this subject a while ago, and Iger too, there was this idea of, okay, well, when we started with movie-going audiences, we started with Iron Man, one of our most sort of plausible earthbound heroes. Even though he goes up into the sky, he does it with technology, not with superpowers. So, a feat of clay hero is where we're going to start, and everyone can feel like they have entry to that. And then it's almost like this is a violent metaphor, but almost like a frog in a pot of water, and you slowly turn up the heat on the water, and all of a sudden, the casual quote unquote movie-going audience is in the comic book world where they're like, oh, sure, portals. Okay. All right. Multiverse. All right. I understand what you're talking about here. And so I think they thought that they had prepared audiences for the thing that comic book readers have spent decades understanding. And I think, to your point, in that Disney Plus era where they're scrambling to try to feed the streaming wars and the never-ending content machine, they go a little too hard with all of the opportunities. And if they had kept it simple to one clear, this is the inciting incident, this is what happens, all the lighting effects look the same, all the portals look the same, we're all doing the same thing, I think that would have set them up for greater success. But I hear what you're saying. I think plenty of people are confused, and then plenty of people are just sort of going with it. Even casuals who don't really fully understand, they're like, I don't really need to know why Andrew Garfield is back. I'm just excited that Andrew Garfield's back, you know? Those of us who overthink are a little like, got our cork boards with our red string on it and are trying to like connect all the dots. And then some people are just like, it was a good movie and I had a good time. And, you know, that matters too. So
The one thing that the MCU's done, and it's a beautiful thing, is they brought back applause to movie theaters, which I think is the coolest thing. Like, I can remember the two loudest applause I've ever heard in any kind of cinema during the course of my 40 years on this planet was when Captain America gets Thor's hammer in Endgame. I was like, the whole theater just lost their shit. And then when Andrew Garfield showed up in Spider-Man No Way Home, that is the one thing, like, you can't replicate feeling. Like, I'm sure that no one in the post-production like, yeah, this is where they're going to applaud or anything like that. It's just something that happens organically. And Dave, so talk to me about the magic of these movies, because we talked about the business side and what it took to make, but you can't take away the magic and what the feels it gives people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That Cap Hammer one is also one of my favorite moments, specifically because it's like a lot of the multiversal stuff you could just like put a familiar face. Like, it's hilarious to me that we're all cheering for Andrew Garfield in that moment, because box office wise, he was in 2 Spider-Man movies you guys did not like as fans, apparently. But here we are, we're like, oh, hey, we like this character. It's just maybe we didn't like some of the things about the movies. But the Captain America Mjolnir one was an idea that was seeded all the way back in Age of Ultron, and they kept tracking it. They knew it was something they wanted to do. It was a really early sticky for an idea in the climactic battle. They're like, at some point, we want to do this. The Russo brothers talk about a little bit in our book. There was some confusion because they were putting together the Endgame fight, and someone read, Thor Ragnarok, and they're like, the moral of that movie is sort of the lightning's in Thor, not that it's from the hammer. And they're like, you know what? We don't care. Audiences are going to accept it because they've been building along with like this little Boy Scout that Chris Evans has been playing. He's now in this cosmic war against some of the most like powerful beings ever. And why wouldn't he just pull this thing that sort of why wouldn't he pull this stunt that grabs it on, condenses the 3 phases into one moment we could all cheer about? And then also, Thor's line that like he knew it all along. Like, you keep the banter that started in the first Avengers when they fought each other in the forest. Doth mother know you wear her drapes? And you accelerate it all the way through phase 3. These characters have like fought each other. They have other like standings and whatnot, but we can all get around this one climactic moment. Is entirely story-based. It's based on you having watched the previous movies. And so it's a payoff. And I think the Andrew Garfield thing is similar. If instead of building a payoff into each movie, which they should absolutely still focus on, these sort of multi-film payoffs can be these gigantic cheer moments that are hard to orchestrate in a 2-hour runtime of other story, but can be orchestrated over like 15 hours of story. And that's sort of what we get to see the payoff for in those particular moments.
The hammer moment is one of my favorite too, because that, and I think the on your left sort of portal opening moment, I believe Kevin Feige himself has tweeted the theater cam footage of that, which is illegally captured footage of his film in the theater. And he's like, yeah, but this is so cool that like even I'm going to tweet this, right? But I think that to both of your larger points, it's a character investment payoff. And that's something that Feige talks about a lot, is that you have to get people to care about these characters. You can't just throw massive CGI slapfests at them and expect them to get like fully invested, or, all the Infinity Stones in the world will not buy you or buy in on Skinny C. Rogers from way back in the day. We can see him in that alleyway getting beaten up, and it's the same guy. And also the big risk they took with Infinity War, where you're like, oh, big risk. They had everyone in that movie. It was going to be success. But that's an Empire Strikes Back ending, right? Where our heroes lose. And then we as an audience have to sit there with our heroes losing. And we have to watch the beloved characters die and stay dead after the disintegration. So we're just feeling like, give us a win. Please give us a win. So when that hammer flies and when those portals open, that's just movie blockbuster magic 101. And that's something that Kevin Feige is absolutely fluent in. I cried in the theater when when Cap gets the hammer, when everyone shows up for him. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, looking forward to everyone reading the book. It is MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios. Joanna Robinson and Dave Gonzales. Joanna, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having us. This was really fun.
And Dave, thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and listeners.
And that'll do it for another episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. That way you'll get new movies as soon as they're available. And if you have a spare moment, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review, which would help other exceptional folks like you discover the show. You can always connect with me on X, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Joe Pardavila or on TikTok at J Pardavila. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.